Good morning. Welcome to Auburn Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, located on occupied ancestral land of the Muskogee Creek Nation and housed in a building constructed by free, formerly enslaved African Americans. My name is Jim Newton, and I am your service associate today. We welcome you. We know you come here for different reasons: to find community, to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps to find the answers to some of your bigger questions. We welcome you. We know you come from different places, different religions, different beliefs, and different backgrounds. We hope you will find comfort, connection, challenge, and love here. We hope you will find ways to provide outreach to others in our congregation, in our local community, and in our world community. On behalf of the members of the fellowship, I extend a special welcome to all visitors who are joining us for the first time, and to those of you who still feel like visitors. If you have not already done so, please fill out a digital visitor card by visiting auuf.org/visitor so that we may welcome you. You may also contact our minister, Reverend Chris Rothbauer, at minister@auuf.org with any questions or concerns you may have. Let us move into the service, willing to be authentic with each other, honest within ourselves, and open to connection in all its forms.
Our opening words are from Susan Maginn. From beyond the playful summer clouds, beyond the earth's thin blue line, from beyond the bright moon and meteor showers, we hear the call to look and listen carefully, to turn away from a world that buys and sells happiness, to fully experience the luring whisper of your heart's truth. Why not today? Why not now? We are here and together at home in this evolving place, here in the ever-changing breath and body, home in this dewy morning, even as it reaches toward a hot, high noon. We hear the call from far beyond and deep within, and we do not hear it alone.
We light our chalice this morning with these words from Viola Abbott. As we light the chalice and fully embrace the sacred space created here this morning, please hold in your hearts the Unitarian Universalist principle, which calls upon us to respect the independent web of all existence of which we are a part. Today, we remember those who share this earth with us no longer. We bear witness to their lives and the roles they have played in ours. We pay homage to and make stronger that web which connects us all. As is our tradition, we also light a candle in solidarity with those families separated at our southern border. Our opening hymn is hymn number 1024 in the Teal hymnal, When the Spirit Says Do. One of the ways we proclaim the warmth and caring of our community is by sharing our joys, concerns, and milestones. We invite you to type your joy, concern, or milestone in the Zoom chat box during the music for meditation.
This is a tribute to Michelle and Tom.
Thank you to all who shared their joys, concerns, and milestones this morning. This joy and concern was submitted in advance for sharing. Michelle Westmoreland died last Tuesday, January 18th, at home, surrounded by friends and family. By her request, there will not be a formal memorial service. Instead, there will be a screening of Michelle's favorite movie, The Princess Bride, on Wednesday, March 2nd at 11 a.m. at the hotel at Auburn University and Dixon Conference Center on College Street in Auburn. Afterwards, weather permitting, people are invited to gather at Kiesel Park. All who wish to remember Michelle are invited to join. Tom is grateful for all the love being shown to him during this time. He has no needs at this time and will let us know if we can do anything. May all the joys, concerns, and milestones of this community, those shared aloud and those held in silence, be received into the care and concern of all present. Angela Farmer will now share our moment for all ages.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be reading for you today, The Lonely Polar Bear by Koa Lee, which was published in 2018 by Design Originals. I'm going to read for you first over here. There's a statement at the beginning of the book. Polar bears face an uncertain future due to climate change, which is causing their habitat to melt. Climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. These shifts may be natural, such as through variations in the solar cycle. But according to the United Nations, since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. Let's find out more about how we can help polar bears survive. There was a snowstorm that lasted for many days. Strong wind was wailing and crying. When the storm was finally over, a polar bear slowly crawled out of an icy cave. He was quite small. The little polar bear wandered around the vast snow-covered land looking for his mommy and his brothers. Suddenly, he saw a strange thing. A little spirit girl from the night sky. There, little friend. The little spirit girl climbed onto the polar bear's back and they walked on and on. They traveled very far. They went a long, long way together. One night they saw an amazing sight. The little girl said, "Look, there's the northern lights. My family is coming. It's time to come home." And so Polar Bear continued walking on his own. Puffins joined him as he swam. The polar bear continued swimming and fish swam past him. "Goodbye, bear." When the polar bear reached land, he continued walking. The elks greeted him with a big "Hello." "Hello," said the polar bear, but he still hadn't found his family. The polar bear made many friends on his journey. He met some noisy friends and some quiet friends. Time passed and the polar bear grew older. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, but he wasn't as big as he should have been. There was little for him to eat on the slowly melting ice. The pieces of ice drifted farther and farther. Without his spirit friend, he felt lost. The polar bear fell asleep and began to dream. He saw the dark winter sky filled with glowing sparkles. Long time no see. Lonely Bear, I have always kept an eye on you. You can only see our light in winter when the sky is dark, but I'm always here. It's okay, spirit friend. Don't worry. I made many other friends, and I'm not lonely anymore. Somewhere in the snowy North Pole, a polar bear is sitting quietly and peacefully, enjoying his beautiful sky filled with northern lights.
Please join me in the spirit of contemplation in whatever way feels right with these words from Peter Morales. What does deep spirituality feel like to you? Spirituality is impossible to define and difficult to describe. For me, it feels like connection. Connection to myself, to others around me, to the earth and all of creation. Connection to myself feels like deep peace, awareness, calm, authenticity. Connection to others feels like compassion, community, acceptance, and enduring love. Spirituality is not an idea, it is an experience. When I experience connection, dividing lines disappear. Inner conflict gives way to integrity. The line that separates my individuality from others fades. We become one. I find connections with my deepest self in times of solidarity, practice, and reflection. I find connection with others in community, often in worship. All the great spiritual traditions teach this. Today, the connection with creation, with the earth and the cosmos may be the most difficult. We live in artificial controlled environments that separate us from the natural world. More than humans in any other time, we live separated from the natural world, the world from which we emerged and that sustains our lives. We so very much need to experience our world. We need to let go of controlling our world and allow ourselves to become one with it. We find ourselves when we lose ourselves. May we connect, really connect. When we do, it changes everything. Blessed be.
The light of our chalice would soon flicker and die without the oil that nourishes its flame. And just as this flame cannot burn without oil, this religious community cannot survive or thrive without the financial as well as personal support of its members and friends. The oil that keeps the flame of our liberal religious faith alive and fuels the shared mission and ministry of this fellowship. Let us now give freely and generously an offering to sustain and strengthen our shared religious community, a community of memory, hope, faith, and love. For we are now the keepers of its flame that burns for justice, its dream of beloved community, its vision of a world made whole. To make a donation online via PayPal, please visit auuf.org/donate. Please indicate in the notes whether your donation is for your pledge or for the offering. If you are writing a check, please make your check payable to AUF with a note on the memo line about whether it is for the offering or your pledge, and mail it to P.O. Box 669, Auburn, Alabama 36831. The offering will now be gratefully received. Our reading today is from Green Action. Environmental justice refers to those cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainability, where all people can hold with confidence that their community and natural environment is safe and productive. Environmental justice is realized when all people can realize their highest potential without interruption by environmental racism or inequity. Environmental justice is supported by decent paying and secure jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing and adequate health care, democratic decision-making, and finally, personal empowerment. A community of environmental justice is one in which both cultural and biological diversity are respected, and where there is equal access to institutions and ample resources to grow and prosper. Environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. Environmental justice is the movement's response to environmental racism. Environmental equity is not environmental justice. Environmental equity is the government's response to the demands of the environmental justice movement. Government agencies like the EPA have been trying to co-opt the movement by redefining environmental justice as fair treatment and meaningful involvement, something they consistently fail to accomplish, but which also falls far short of the environmental justice vision. The environmental justice movement isn't seeking to simply redistribute environmental harms, but to abolish them. Environmental racism refers to the institutional rules, regulations, and policies of government and or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lacks enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. Environmental racism is caused by several factors, including intentional neglect, the alleged need for a receptacle for pollutants in urban areas, and the lack of institutional power and low land values of people of color. It is a well-documented fact that communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by polluting industries and very specifically hazardous waste facilities, and lacks regulation of these industries.
I don't want to be recording. I don't know what's happening.
In high school, I got involved with my high school's environmental club. I was very concerned about the stories that I was hearing about the impact of humans on the climate, and I wanted to do something to try to help it. And we did do a lot. We went out and did cleanups of polluted areas. We learned about animals and their habitats. We talked about how important it is to be mindful of our actions. And we even learned about how to be one with nature. But all in all, I eventually fell away from the environmental club, because while we were doing a lot in terms of the amount of action we were taking, it just didn't feel like anything was making a difference. It felt like all of our focus was on the wilderness out there, and not much was getting done about actually cleaning things up. This dichotomy, the dichotomy between wilderness and so-called civilization, became even starker for me during my year at a Shinto shrine in Suzuka, Japan. You see, while most of the more touristy shrines are in these picturesque, quote-unquote, natural environments, surrounded by trees or water or mountains, there are also shrines in much more unusual places. While my shrine was at the base of an absolutely beautiful mountain range, there is a shrine in Nagoya, Japan, that is at the top of a skyscraper. And while this may seem unusual for an earth-based religion, the priests would explain to me that they saw no contradiction in this. Indeed, one of the things that they offered to people was to bring their car by and get it blessed when they were about to go on a road trip, blessed in the hopes that they wouldn't get involved in an accident on the way. What I've come to realize over the years is that the Shinto, like many indigenous religions, don't see a difference between what's out there and what's in here. Indeed, everything is part of one interconnected whole. Even the environmental destruction that we're committing can only be understood as something natural, because it is part of the natural universe. And I think that's part of what a lot of the modern environmental movement gets wrong, is seeing what needs to be done as being out there. We need to create more national parks, more protected areas. And that's not a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I love the fact that there are places where I can go and just be surrounded by trees. But it's not enough. Because what ends up happening is we're able to shift our attention to those places while still dumping our degradation in other places. Danielle Purifoy, an environmental justice scholar, posits that conservationism, which has historically been white-led, sits in persistent and unnecessary tension with environmental protection of communities of color. She says it's because it is white, because its primary considerations reflect the interests of mostly white and wealthier people to the literal exclusion of non-whites. She goes on to talk about how environmentalism traces its origin to colonialism, to indigenous land grabs, and to the racialized conceptualizations of nature as dominated space. Indeed, some of the early environmentalists were social Darwinists. Madison Grant was one of them. He, along with other early environmentalists such as Gifford Pinchot and U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, maintained that whites were the most capable and civilized humans whose duty was to conquer and manage inferior people for the quest of the new world and its resources. To give an example, those national parks that I love to visit now, they were once the land of Native Americans, and in some cases, Native Americans were expelled in order to create the national parks. A more recent example comes in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. As cleanup was beginning around the city, environmental groups were not concerned about the environmental impact towards communities of color at all. Indeed, one Black neighborhood was only preserved because there was a species of owl there who would have become extinct had it not been. Too often, environmentalism focuses exclusively on preserving nature without humans. And this misses the degradation. That environmental degradation has a disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as the global South in general. And the way that this environmental degradation affects communities of color is often minimized or ignored. Daniel Purifoy says that this is not to say, of course, that non-human species conservation is not of serious concern to Black and brown communities. Rather, human and non-human conservation for our mutual survival cannot be disentangled. What I want to propose is that there's a deep need for intersectionality in the environmental justice movement. If you're not familiar with the concept of intersectionality, it comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, a critical race theory scholar, who says that the interconnected nature of social categories such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, are regarded as overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. For example, a Black woman can be discriminated against in this country, both for being Black and a woman. But what those two things miss is that she can also be discriminated against for being a Black woman in a different way than a Black man or a white woman might be discriminated against. It recognizes that systems of inequality are more complicated than any one identity marker. The problem with non-intersectional movements is that they missed the lived experience of the people within them. No one movement is homogeneous. We need everyone's experiences in order to bring about real change. And non-intersectional movements exclude some of those people who could be doing great work within them and miss the perspectives that could revolutionize our awareness of systems of inequality. In order to truly fight climate change and environmental degradation, we must integrate the experiences of people traditionally excluded from the environmental movement. And we must be willing to bring in voices that have traditionally been marginalized if we hope to reverse the damage that's been done to our environment. Race matters to environmentalism. Ibram X. Kendi, the race scholar, calls our current climate policy do-nothing climate policy. He says do-nothing climate policy is racist policy, since the predominantly non-white global South is being victimized by climate change more than the white global North, even as the whiter global North is contributing more to its acceleration. And Justin Moreland, writing in Time, describes environmental racism as discriminatory housing policy, the way discriminatory housing policy throughout the years forced people of color into some neighborhoods. And racist lending practices meant that land in those neighborhoods was less just because minorities resided there. Do you want to guess where most of the environmental dumping and degradation is taking place? It's not in the white neighborhoods. In fact, over the years, I've heard stories over and over again about the way that communities of color have been degraded, either through dumping or just by being taken away. An interesting story if you haven't heard it. Did you know that part of Central Park in New York was once a primarily community of color? The neighborhood was completely taken away and razed down to create a park for the predominantly white people at the time. When we devalue communities like this, it makes the land ripe for polluting industries because those people have less power to be able to stop them from coming in and doing what they will. These industries need large spaces for their facilities. And these racist practices mean that they're able to more easily get buy-in by arguing that they're creating jobs when in reality they're degrading the environment. Moreover, the companies that owned and operated these facilities knew that minority groups largely lacked any power to stop them. Climate change is hitting communities of color and the global South first, and it will continue to hit them harder first. Elizabeth Yempierre says that climate change is the result of a legacy of extraction, of colonialism, and of slavery. All throughout the history of our nation, people of color have gotten worse food, the worst health care, the worst treatment, and when freed, were given lands that were eventually surrounded by things like petrochemical industries. And as long as we're okay with this, as long as we continue to allow these industries to do this, they will continue to. The arrival of slavery in our country came with a repurposing of the land, she says, chopping down trees, disrupting water systems and other ecological systems that come with supporting the effort to build a capitalist society and to provide resources for the privileged, using the bodies of Black people to facilitate that. Climate change is the child of all this destruction and all of those oppressive decisions. And it's impossible to separate the systems of oppression that surround us from the environmental degradation because they're interconnected. When we're able to misuse people, we're able to a lot easier justify our misuse of the land. So it shouldn't be surprising that the communities most affected today by pollution and by COVID are communities of color. Because white supremacy and capitalism fueled and continues to fuel the environmental crisis, they must be taken into account for any robust environmental justice movement. Yes, Let's continue to create beautiful natural lands that remind us of our birthright to the earth. But we also need to create a movement that recognizes the intersectionality of environmental justice issues. Though conservation is important by itself, it will not create a more just world until we bring anti-racism and anti-classism into the conversation. We must recognize that the legacy of racism, colonialism, and economic inequality in this country is the legacy of climate change. And I believe that intersectionality can lead to a multidimensional, multi-tactic environmental justice movement. I have this thought in my head of what would it be like if, when we were sitting home in our houses or our apartments, we recognized that we were still in a natural environment. What would it be like if our hikes through the woods or camping in the wilderness was not the only time we felt connected, but that we recognize that every single time we take a breath, we are surrounded by the natural beauty. And if we're not seeing the natural beauty, what would it be like to change things? Now imagine communities of color every day without the power to change any of that, who just have to take the pollution, the disease, the COVID, the degradation, and have no power to stop it. What would it be like for these communities to become a shrine to something much more beautiful? I suspect that if we had an attitude more like the Shinto, we might take these things a little more seriously as a society. What I want to propose is finding solutions that benefit the entire interdependent web of life. And that's not going to be through piecemeal environmentalism that creates a few nice little getaway places here and there, but keeps dumping in these poor communities without the power to stop them. When we view environmental injustice as the result of other systems of inequality, environmental justice becomes synonymous with racial justice. In the words of one class that I took last year, they are the same. Our system encourages us to view different systems of oppression as being in competition because that makes it easier for none of them to be able to succeed. But what if we recognized that when we fight for one, we fight for all? And it becomes possible, rather than separating our resources and dividing them among different silos coming together for different causes, we create a movement that brings about lasting change. I believe it would lead to us recognizing that our liberations are bound up with each other. We don't connect the environmental justice movement and the racial justice movement in order to help someone else, but because our destinies are intertwined and our liberations depend upon each other, because the existential threat of climate change, our very survival, might depend on expanding our view of what environmental justice means. Because if we destroy communities of color, if we destroy the global South, eventually the degradation is going to reach those wealthier communities that have the privilege not to think about it. I decided to preach 2 similar sermons in a row because we're talking about environmental justice as a social justice focus this year. And it seemed very appropriate as we're talking about, thinking about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King this month, to think about how that was just the tip of the iceberg of what needs to be done. I leave you today with a thought from marine biologist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She says to white people who care about maintaining a habitable planet, I need you to become actively anti-racist. I need you to understand that our racial inequality crisis is intertwined with our climate crisis. If we don't work on both, we will succeed at neither. By expanding our idea of what climate justice means, I believe we might just find a way to survive. And in the midst of it, it might just bring humanity a little closer together, because it'll remind us that in the midst of it, in the midst of everything, what we need is each other to survive. May it be so. Our closing hymn is number 1028 in the Till hymnal, The Fire of Commitment.
Please join me in extinguishing our chalice. You will find the words in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please be our guest today after the service for our virtual coffee hour. We'll leave the room open for conversation following the service. If you are not signed up for our email list, please make sure to do so to receive updates about ways to connect. You can find information on signing up at our website, auuf.org/subscribe. Please join us now for our sung benediction. No.
Love our earth, take action to consume less, use less energy, respect water, and be cooperative, collaborative, and creative community. Like the moss and the mushrooms, our children's lives depend upon us. Amen. Blessed be, and go in peace.